My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am 56 years old, and until 6 weeks ago, I thought I understood the boundaries of my family, our silences, our polite distances, and the unspoken rules that kept us from stepping too far into each other's lives. But my husband's funeral changed everything. Hello, before I continue my story, kindly take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Thank you. It was a crisp October morning in Westchester County, New York. The air was sharp with that bittersweet scent of fallen leaves, and the sky was a flawless blue, as though nature itself refused to mourn with me. The church was modest but full. Neighbors from our cul-de-sac, former colleagues from the investment firm where Daniel had worked for over 25 years, and family, of course. I wore black, the kind of black that swallows you whole. Dress, gloves, veil, the entire armor of a grieving widow. I wasn't acting. My chest ached in that hollow, unbearable way that grief demands. But layered beneath the grief was something I didn't want to admit to myself: suspicion. My sister, Margaret Lawson, arrived late. She was in a deep burgundy coat, the color you'd choose for a dinner party, not a funeral. Her hair was perfectly styled, her lipstick freshly applied. She didn't rush to my side. Instead, she moved like she was entering a gala, giving air kisses to distant cousins and pausing just a little too long in front of Daniel's framed portrait. Her son, Oliver, trailed behind her, holding a card that I suspect she'd made him sign in the car. We'd never been close, Margaret and I. Our relationship was like a polite, neighborly handshake, functional, non-intrusive, and entirely devoid of intimacy. Still, something about her demeanor that day felt off. During the service, I caught her exchanging glances with our cousin Philip, as if there were some private conversation happening silently across the pews. After the burial, we gathered at my home for a quiet reception. The house smelled of fresh coffee and the rosemary focaccia our neighbor, Linda, had baked. Friends mingled, voices low, as if raising them too high might break me. Margaret drifted from guest to guest, but she didn't once approach me to offer condolences beyond the initial. "You're holding up so well, Ellie." In the corner of the living room, I overheard her laugh, not the gentle, pitying laugh you'd expect in such a setting, but her usual high-pitched tinkle, the one she used when something was deliciously scandalous. I looked over, and she quickly masked it with a solemn expression, but not before I caught the faint glimmer in her eyes. That night, after the guests left, I stood in the kitchen sipping cold chamomile tea, staring at the framed wedding photo of Daniel and me on the mantel. His arm was wrapped around my waist, his smile steady and easy, the way it always had been. And yet, a small, unwelcome thought lodged itself in my mind. What had Margaret and Philip been silently communicating during the service? Why had she seemed so oddly pleased? I told myself it was just grief making me paranoid, that funerals had a way of twisting people's expressions, making them seem cruel when they were only tired. But deep down, I knew this wasn't paranoia. It was the beginning of something, though I couldn't yet see the shape of it. A week later, I ran into Philip at the local market. He was picking over Granny Smith apples like they were diamonds, and I caught him off guard when I greeted him. We made small talk about the weather, about Thanksgiving plans, but there was a hesitation in his tone, a flicker in his eyes whenever Daniel's name came up. I considered pressing him, but the thought of stirring whatever this was felt premature. Margaret called me only once in those weeks following the funeral, and it was not to check on me. Instead, she invited me to Oliver's 10th birthday party. "It'll be good for you to be around family again," she'd said, her voice oddly buoyant. I accepted, telling myself it would be harmless. After all, Oliver was my nephew, and Daniel had always been fond of him. It was just a birthday party, cake and laughter, and maybe a bittersweet moment or two. But in my gut, I knew that something was waiting for me there, something Margaret had been sitting on, something she was almost excited to deliver. And as I marked the date on my calendar, I felt the same unease I'd felt in the church that October morning, when she walked in late wearing that inappropriate burgundy coat. I should have trusted that feeling. Margaret's house in Greenwich was everything she'd always wanted mine to be: open concept kitchen, white marble counters, and windows that stretched nearly floor to ceiling, flooding the space with pale winter light. By the time I arrived, the living room was alive with the chatter of parents and the shrieks of children darting between legs with balloons and party hats. I'd brought Oliver a Lego robotics set, the kind Daniel would have chosen himself. I handed it to him, and his face lit up before he disappeared into the throng of kids. I tried to focus on him, on the cake, on anything but the gnawing sense that this day would not be ordinary. Margaret greeted me with that signature smile of hers, all teeth, zero warmth. "Ellie, darling, so glad you could make it." "You look rested," she said, her gaze sweeping over me like she was taking inventory. I gave her a polite nod, avoiding small talk. The first hour passed uneventfully. We sang Happy Birthday. Oliver blew out the candles, and parents began to gather their coats. I was about to say my goodbyes when Margaret clinked her champagne flute against a dessert fork. The chatter dimmed. The children's squeals softened into curious silence. "I have something important to share with you all," she began, her voice carrying the practiced tone of someone delivering a wedding toast. It's not the kind of thing I'd usually say at a party. But, well, it's time the truth came out. She glanced around the room, her eyes finally landing on me. My pulse quickened. "You all knew Daniel," she continued, "and you knew he and I were close in more ways than one." The air seemed to thicken. Several guests exchanged startled glances, a few parents awkwardly pulling their children closer. Margaret's next words sliced clean through the hum of the party. "Oliver is Daniel's son. My son is your late husband's child, Eleanor." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. My brain tried to reconcile the words with the setting, the half-eaten cake, the stray balloons, the faint scent of buttercream in the air. It didn't make sense, and yet it did. That flicker at the funeral, the burgundy coat, the laugh. A low murmur rippled through the guests. One of our cousins gasped audibly. My fingers tightened around the stem of my water glass. Margaret wasn't done. She turned toward me fully now, her eyes glittering. "Which brings me to something else. Since Oliver is Daniel's biological child, it's only fair that he receives what's rightfully his. That includes a share of Daniel's estate." There it was. Not grief. Not closure. A transaction. I'm talking about the house, Eleanor. Half of it. It's worth about 600,000, isn't it? Her voice was steady, almost smug. "Oliver deserves his inheritance." The room fell silent. Even the children, sensing the tension, froze mid-play. I caught sight of Linda, my neighbor, her jaw slack as she looked from Margaret to me. Another guest shook her head slowly, like she couldn't believe what she'd just witnessed. I set my glass down carefully on the counter, my heartbeat so loud I could hear it in my ears. I thought about the years Daniel and I had spent together, about how this house had come into my life before I even knew him, purchased with the inheritance from my parents. I thought about the gall it took for someone to choose a child's birthday party, their own child's birthday party, as the stage for such a public ambush. Margaret crossed her arms, her posture screaming victory, as if she'd cornered me into a confession or a concession. But she didn't know me as well as she thought she did. I drew in a slow breath and forced my voice to remain calm, almost conversational. "Are you quite finished, Margaret?" I asked. A few people chuckled nervously, unsure if they should stay or excuse themselves. She tilted her head, smiling faintly. "For now." It was in that moment I decided I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me rattle. She wanted a scene, tears, outrage, shouting. I would give her none of it. Instead, I lifted my chin, already planning exactly what I'd say next, and knowing it would knock the smugness clean off her face. But not yet. Not until I had the entire room's attention. And I did. Every eye was on me. I let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable, the kind that makes people shuffle their feet and glance nervously toward the door. I wanted Margaret to sit in her own words, to feel the weight of the eyes now fixed on her. "You seem confident about this," I said finally, my tone as steady as if we were discussing the weather. "You've made quite a claim, Margaret, that my husband fathered your child. And now you're telling a room full of people you want half of my house." She didn't flinch. "Not want, Eleanor. Deserve. Oliver is Daniel's son, and that means he is entitled to his father's property. The law is on my side." The arrogance in her voice was like a drumbeat in my skull. Around us, conversations started in low whispers, people debating the legalities, others speculating on the scandal. One man muttered something about DNA tests. Margaret took a step closer, lowering her voice only slightly, though still loud enough for half the room to hear. You've had a good life in that house. I'm not trying to take it away from you. Just half. For Oliver's future. You wouldn't deny your nephew what's rightfully his, would you? I looked her square in the eye. You seem very sure about his paternity. Her lips curled. Oh, I am. She glanced briefly at Oliver, who was lingering near the kitchen door, confusion written across his face. And so was Daniel. He and I talked about it more than once. I felt a strange mixture of pity for Oliver and a cold, calculated anger toward Margaret. This wasn't about the boy. He was just the pawn she'd chosen for her play. This was about Margaret, her greed, her need to level the playing field she thought existed between us. I took a slow step toward her, closing the space between us until there was only the faint scent of her expensive perfume, something citrusy and sharp between us. You said the law is on your side. But Margaret, the law only protects what exists. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. I'm sorry to disappoint you, I continued, but Daniel didn't own the house. He never did. My parents bought that house outright, before I even met him. It's in my name alone. No co-ownership. No mortgage with both our names. Even if Oliver were Daniel's son, which I am not confirming, there is no inheritance to be had from this property, because it isn't part of Daniel's estate. The murmurs around us grew louder now, the kind of noise people make when they witness a balloon pop unexpectedly. Margaret's face tightened, her posture stiffening as if she'd been slapped. That's irrelevant, she said, though her voice had lost a layer of its confidence. It's entirely relevant, I replied. You can't claim what doesn't belong to someone, Margaret. No matter the truth about paternity, no matter what you've convinced yourself of, there's nothing here for you. Not legally. Not morally. Someone near the counter, I think it was my neighbor Linda, let out a small, involuntary laugh. A few others smiled behind their hands. The tide of the room had shifted, and Margaret could feel it. Her gaze darted around, looking for an ally. But even those who might have indulged her gossip before were suddenly fascinated by the half-empty plates of cake in front of them. She was on her own now. Her voice rose slightly, a sign she was starting to lose control. So you're just going to pretend this doesn't matter? That my son isn't. I'm not pretending anything, I interrupted, keeping my voice calm. But I'm not giving you half a house that never belonged to Daniel. You've turned what should have been a joyful day for your son into a spectacle. That's on you. For a second, I thought she might lash out physically. Her shoulders were tense, her hands clenched at her sides. But then she drew in a sharp breath, forcing her expression into something neutral. Fine, she said at last, her voice brittle. But this isn't over. She turned on her heel and stalked toward the kitchen, leaving behind the faint trace of her perfume and a room thick with shock. Guests avoided my eyes, unsure if they should offer comfort or pretend the moment hadn't happened. I excused myself to the hallway, needing a moment away from the oppressive hum of whispers. I leaned against the wall, staring at the framed photo of Oliver from a previous birthday. Cheeks round, eyes bright, blissfully unaware of the tangled web of adult pettiness and betrayal. Whatever Margaret did next, I knew she had crossed a line she could never uncross, and I knew I would have to be ready for whatever fallout was coming. When I stepped back into the living room, most of the guests were in that awkward limbo between wanting to leave and feeling too invested in the drama to walk out. Margaret was by the kitchen counter, pretending to busy herself with slicing leftover cake for the kids, but the tightness around her mouth betrayed her embarrassment. I cleared my throat just enough to draw attention, but not enough to seem theatrical. I think I should make something perfectly clear, I said, letting my gaze sweep over the room. A hush fell again, the same way it had when Margaret had made her announcement. Even Oliver was standing still now, clutching a balloon string like it might anchor him in the moment. I've been in this house for over 20 years, I began, my voice steady, the weight of my words deliberate. I bought it before I met Daniel. My parents helped me make that purchase. Daniel was never on the title, never paid a mortgage here, because there wasn't one. So whether or not there's any truth to what Margaret claims about paternity, This home is not, and never was, part of his estate. A few heads nodded. One guest muttered, exactly under their breath. Margaret kept her back to me, but I could see her shoulders tense as she carefully placed another slice of cake on a paper plate. I went on. Let's also remember, I said, that even if it were part of his estate, there are proper, respectful ways to handle questions of inheritance. Cornering a grieving widow at a child's birthday party isn't one of them. My tone wasn't sharp, but the steel underneath was undeniable. There was a ripple of uncomfortable shifting among the guests. A woman I recognized from Margaret's book club stared at the floor. Another guest sipped their champagne like it was a lifeline. Margaret finally turned around, her smile a brittle mask. I was only speaking the truth, she said, lifting her chin. Truth, I replied softly, has its time and place. And if you thought Daniel owed you something, there were ways to address that while he was still alive. You chose this moment because you wanted an audience, Margaret. Well, you've got one. A faint chuckle came from somewhere near the sofa. The tension shifted again, this time against her. She tried to recover, shrugging as if this was all a misunderstanding. I only want what's fair for Oliver. And I want what's fair for him too, I said. Fair is not growing up with his birthday remembered as the day his mother publicly accused her sister of lying and demanded part of a house she had no claim to. Fair is protecting him from adult feuds and petty greed. That's what's fair. For the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes that wasn't arrogance. It was discomfort. Maybe even shame. I turned to Oliver, softening my tone. Happy birthday, sweetheart. I hope you enjoy your Lego set. Daniel always thought you were very bright. The boy smiled faintly, confused but pleased to be acknowledged. I knew he didn't fully understand what had just happened, but I also knew that one day he would. And when he did, I wanted him to remember that I had kept my voice calm, that I hadn't turned his party into a shouting match, no matter how much his mother had tried. I set my empty glass down on the counter and walked toward the front door. The crowd parted without a word, a silent acknowledgement that the matter had been settled, at least in this room, on this day. Outside, the cold air hit me like a blessing. I drew in a deep breath, my pulse finally starting to steady. The sky was still clear, the winter sun pale but steady above the treeline. My heels clicked on the driveway as I walked to my car, each step feeling like the punctuation at the end of a sentence I hadn't planned to write. As I drove home, I thought about how Daniel might have handled this, his calm, his measured way of never letting Margaret pull him into her orbit of chaos. I realized that in my own way, I'd done exactly what he would have wanted. Kept my dignity, spoken my truth, and left without giving her the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. But something told me Margaret wasn't finished. And if she thought she could come at me again, she'd find I was more prepared than she'd ever imagined. 2 days later, the calls started. First it was my cousin Philip, his voice low and careful, as if afraid I might hang up. Ellie, I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened at the party. None of us expected Margaret to do that. I told him I appreciated the sentiment, but I wasn't interested in dissecting it. Still, the apology was telling. It meant the whispers had already traveled through the family tree, and Margaret's stunt was the main branch everyone was discussing. By the end of the week, 3 other relatives had called, each with their own variation of "we don't condone what she did," but none willing to confront her directly. That was the thing about my family. They loved gossip, but they hated confrontation. It didn't take long for Margaret to reach out herself. Her text was short, "We need to talk." I didn't respond. The next day, she sent another, "You humiliated me in front of everyone." I was only asking for Oliver's rights. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then locked my phone without typing a word. You can't argue with someone who doesn't recognize the difference between rights and entitlement. From mutual acquaintances, I heard that Margaret had been painting herself as the wronged party, telling anyone who would listen that I was cold and selfish, that I didn't care about Oliver's well-being. She even claimed I'd twisted the truth about the house. But the damage was already done. The people who'd been there that day knew what they'd seen. Some of them told me privately they'd lost respect for her, especially for involving Oliver in a stunt that was so clearly about her and not him. One woman from her book club stopped attending altogether, unable to pretend nothing had happened. As for Oliver, I saw him once more in the weeks that followed. He was with his father, Margaret's ex-husband, Brian, at the grocery store. Brian greeted me warmly, though there was a heaviness in his eyes. Oliver waved shyly, and I waved back. I wondered if Brian had heard Margaret's version of events, and if so, whether he believed her. At night, I found myself replaying the moment in the living room. The clink of her champagne glass, the hush that fell, the way she'd stood there so certain she had the upper hand. It wasn't just about the house, I realized. It was about control. Margaret had been trying to reclaim some imagined balance between us, to rewrite the story of our lives so that she was the one with leverage. But she'd miscalculated. The truth about ownership, about the law, about the boundaries I was willing to defend, it had all left her with less than she'd started with. A month later, I hosted a small dinner for a few close friends. Over wine and roasted chicken, the conversation eventually turned to family drama. Not mine specifically, but the kind that bubbles up in every family sooner or later. Someone joked that funerals and birthdays were the perfect breeding ground for secrets to spill. I smiled faintly at that, thinking of Daniel's funeral and Oliver's birthday, how they'd been bookends to a revelation I hadn't asked for, but had handled on my own terms. It struck me then that betrayal, no matter how sharp, eventually dulls into something you can hold without bleeding. You stop wondering why someone did it and start focusing on how you'll carry yourself afterward. Margaret and I haven't spoken since that day at her house. I don't expect we will anytime soon. I've heard she's still telling her version of events, but the circle of people who listen has grown smaller. Secrets, once exposed, lose their shine quickly. And me, I've kept living in my house, the one my parents gave me, the one Daniel never owned but loved as his home. The winter has given way to spring now, the garden waking up in greens and yellows. Sometimes I stand at the kitchen window with my coffee, looking out at the yard and thinking how this space, this quiet, is the only inheritance I need from the life I built with Daniel. Margaret thought she could stake a claim in it with nothing more than a public declaration. What she didn't understand was that a claim isn't the same as a right. And no matter how loudly you say something in a room full of people, the truth doesn't change to suit you. I've learned that when someone tries to shake the foundation you've built your life on, the best thing you can do is stand still, speak plainly, and let their noise collapse under its own weight. Thank you for watching. Kindly like and subscribe to the channel. Until I come your way with another story, for now from me, it is bye.